Hello, this is Professor William Foster coming at you from Tucson, Arizona. He has a bachelor's degree in religion and philosophy as well as a PhD in the internet in China, and he's here to talk to y'all a little bit today about the history of ethics.
Hi, class. Hope you feel comfortable with me coming this way. I'm quite open to feedback as to what works and what doesn't. Like we said, we're all making this online internet learning together, and so I'm just trying to do what works. My goal here right now is to give you about a 10-minute history of the history of philosophy and how it has influenced ethical decision making. There's an interesting question. I pretty much spent years of my life reading philosophy, starting with Plato's Republic and through Bacon. I spent a whole year reading Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit in German, and then Derrida in French. And I guess, what I want to do is, it is very clear to me that the past 4,000 years of Western philosophical history influences anybody doing ethics. That is a no-brainer. The question that I really don't know is, which books do you need to read? Who do you need to understand? Can you go to Wikipedia and in 5 minutes get what's going on with Hegel and the Phenomenology of Spirit? I really don't even have an answer. I think some of you who want to really focus on, say, medical ethics, may be better looking at medical decision making. If, on the other hand, you really love philosophy and would love to have a job teaching ethics, I'd recommend going down and reading Plato's Republic and trying to figure out the cave. So I guess what I'm saying is, I'm trying to give you an overview of key books and philosophies. If it's important, look it up on Wikipedia. If it's more important, buy the book. The key thing to understand, I took a semester off from Williams College and went to Calvin College, where I studied with the Calvinist philosopher H. Evan Runner. And H. Evan Runner was based his lectures on a bunch of Dutch philosophers, including Dooyeweerd. Basically, it's very clear that starting 3,000 or 4,000 years ago in Greece, there was an incredible division between Greeks who believed that there were actual universal norms that governed human behavior and that were actually more real than human life itself, and the others who were deeply skeptical and believed that basically life was a river. How could you create norms in a river when it was flowing past you? So this contradiction between a belief that there are really universals that govern ethics and a deep, deep distrust that this is actually true has governed Western philosophy for 3,000 years. Books and books and books have been written trying to figure this out in many different ways. I honestly believe everybody should try and read Plato's Republic and to understand what the hell Plato meant by universal forms, and read his analogy of the cave when he tries to explain what a form is. I'll leave it at that. I believe that Plato's Republic is on the internet now in English and in Greek. I'd recommend at least pulling it down, and at least you could say, hey, in my ethics class, I did read Plato's Republic. It'll get you, I think it's worth doing, but it is not a requirement for the class. But the key thing is to understand that Plato, who was Socrates' student, it's not at all clear Socrates believed in forms. Socrates only asked questions, which I'd be smart if I did. But Plato taught his student, who was Aristotle, and Aristotle developed a whole philosophy based on the idea of universal norms that was influenced Aquinas, who basically created a tradition that lasted through the Catholic Church of what was real, that lasted over 1,000 years. And so when people talk about scholasticism, it was basically taking the Christianity and the Greek forms and creating a system of what was true and what was knowledge. In some ways, this created structure for people. There are a lot done in the name of Catholicism, but the reality is, when someone like Galileo came along and using math and experiment showed that something like scholasticism was wrong, what did they do to Galileo? What did they hung people for challenging the truth. So anyway, if you haven't seen a really good movie about Galileo and science, that might be the most important assignment I can give, because you have to realize there were these very brave people like Galileo and Newton who were saying, hey, we should be basing our views of what is true based on experiment and math, not on scholasticism. So, and this had important issues for ethics, but more important for science. And I took a great course at Catholic University about Francis Bacon. Basically Francis Bacon started shifting the whole reality towards science and towards hypothesis testing, rather than on received wisdom from the church. So Francis Bacon is really important. Watch the movie about Galileo and read something about Francis Bacon. People aren't really clear who Francis Bacon was. Some people say he was William Shakespeare. I'm not going to speak on that. All I'm going to say is people began to realize that it was all right to question and do hypothesis testing to drive science. There's a whole series of philosophers in what became known as the Enlightenment, struggling between, do we hold on to universal values, or is basically everything irrational? And there is really no guide for morals. I strongly recommend reading a little bit about Mills and the whole view of utilitarianism. Basically, Mills said, if it is good for everybody, it's a good thing. So that's utilitarianism. The better things are for everybody, the better ethically they are. That is really so. You had that Mills. There was and at the same time you had something very important that's very hard to understand, which is called German idealism. And in some ways, German idealism tried through numbers of different ways, whether it was through society, whether like Dilthey and Max Weber, or whether it was through Hegel. And Hegel used philosophy to create universals. Very complex stuff. But what's important about Hegel was that Karl Marx, we've all heard of Marxism. Have we read Das Kapital? It should be a must-read on your list. But basically, that Marx turned Hegel on his head and said technology is the driver of universals. And it was going to drive to universal consciousness and to a collective consciousness. So basically, if we're studying ethics and science and technology, one of the things that happened with Karl Marx that was taken up by the Chinese and the Russians was this belief that technology would drive our values and it drive us. It didn't matter what you did, or technology was the sword of philosophy. So so that the impact of that is very important, because last week we wrote about the beloved community. You should realize that first and foremost, Martin Luther King was a Hegelian, but he was a Christian Hegelian, not a Marxist Hegelian. And so when you write about Martin Luther King's ethics, you really have to take Hegel and what Hegel was saying seriously. And it used to drive Martin Luther King crazy when journalists would come and ask him if he was a communist, because he really was not a Marxist. He did not believe that technology was driving ethics. He believed it was love and consciousness. So another piece that's very difficult to read, but what happened in France over the past 50, 60 years were what are called the deconstructionists, starting out with Heidegger from Germany, but then with Foucault and then Jacques Derrida. Basically, they started saying anything out of Western that believes in universals, they began to be able to deconstruct it and show there was no basis for claiming any sort of universal. They almost sort of said there was a sickness in the West desiring universal. So, what do you think? Do you buy Derrida, and are you ready to let go of universals? Derrida had a book called Writing Indifference, was really good. He also had a great book on Plato. Plato actually attacked writing as destroying memory and intelligence. So basically, Plato wrote a book in writing against writing. Of anything to read of Derrida's is Derrida's attack on, or his reading of Plato and Plato's attack on writing. So those are major players. Another thing that really is important, I trust you've all read Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolution. But basically that book that was published, I think in the 60s, pretty much any scientist has read, and it points out that there are paradigms in science. Science has not been one stream that we can, that, you know, but rather that there are different epochs, and each has a different stream in science. Okay, so anyway, that is almost a must-read if you're going to be a scientist, a doctor, or even if you're taking this course. So in conclusion, you should, if you're, by the end of this class, you should be able to sort of mention these people's names and why they're important. I will let you know what the final exam is going to be. The final exam, basically what I want you to do is to take one specific scientific discipline and explain your ethics for that discipline. And I want you to root that in the history of Western and Chinese thought. So anyway, feel free to send me questions or via email or in the group discussion. I guess the interesting question becomes, so the question for this week on the discussion board is, if we are going to do ethics, should we study philosophy? I don't have an answer. I look forward to seeing what you say. Will Foster signing out. Bye.